Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sausalito Public Library for tonight's Sausalito People event. This is the third program in our series with Paolo Salvagione. Before I introduce Paolo, though, I thought I would first actually introduce myself. I'm Abbott Chambers, the city librarian here in Sausalito. Thank you. And welcome to our recently remodeled space. And by remodeling and creating this central space, having all this furniture that we can roll out of the way, it's now possible for us to have programs like this. So this is the biggest crowd we've had yet for one of these events, and it's a great sign because I'd like to keep doing this. So Sausalito People, next week, this time, Friday, April 19th, we've got Gordy Nash. He's a sailboat racer and rebuilder, the founder of Sausalito's open water rowing regatta. Also the founder of the now defunct Funky Boat Race that was held down on the waterfront for years. The week after that, Friday, April 26th, we've got Maria Finn. She's an author and journalist, also a Sausalito resident. Her most recent book is called The Whole Fish: How Adventurous Eating Will Make You Healthier, Sexier, and Help Save the Ocean. She's currently finishing up a book about an all-women female fishing boat in Alaska, and she'll be reading from that book and then talking about her other works. And then on Friday, May 3rd, we have two children's book authors who live in Sausalito's Spring Street neighborhood, Amy Noveski and Bethany Murguia. Thank you. So on to tonight's speaker. Paolo Salvagione was born in Chicago and at an early age moved with his family to southern France, where he developed an affection for bullfighting. He spent his teen years in Albuquerque, New Mexico, living around the corner from photographer Joel Peter Witkin, whom he occasionally assisted with set construction and corpse transportation. Well, there'll be a question period after Paolo speaks. He spent his college years in Manhattan reading philosophy. Grounded in the practice of thinking about things, he spent half a decade circling the world, setting up bicycle factories from Italy to Indonesia. He also worked for over a decade as lead engineer on the 10,000-year clock of the Long Now Foundation. In his art, Salvagione has sent studio visitors out one second-story window and in another on a 900-pound steel wheel. He has used a laser cutter to give negative space a razor-sharp edge, creating a frozen bellows of light. He has filled a World War I gymnasium with a mix of pure geometry and pure fun in the form of 10 oversized swings. Paolo is an autodidact by trade, and yet, as the son of a printmaker and the grandson of a sculptor and of an architect, very much an artist schooled in tradition. His works balance humor and craftsmanship, the novel and the banal, the tactile and the conceptual. Paolo currently lives in Sausalito, where he's kept a studio for almost 20 years. His girlfriend is a beekeeper. Please join me in welcoming Paolo Salvagione.
Good evening. I'm gonna start my talk right here because part of my practice is this idea of how do you get an audience to participate. And in the years of looking at art, I've always wondered, what are the ways to engage people that get them to move from the audience position into the participant position? So I'm going to move into the artist position now and talk a little bit about my work. One of the assets that we have here in Marin is the Headland Center for the Arts. I don't know how many of you have been up there, but it's a really wonderful place. And in 2010, I was awarded a residency there. And I'm going to show you some of the work from that time that answers this question of how do you move someone from the audience to the participatory role. This is the gymnasium. It has the oldest bowling alley west of the Rockies. It's actually amazing. It has manual pin setters down below. If you ever get a chance, just ignore the art. Go look at the bowling alley. It's really amazing. And upstairs was a gymnasium used for exercise. The question that was asked of me for this project by the executive director was, how can we get people to exercise in a gymnasium when they come out and for our work? And so I spent about, I don't know, 2 or 3 days drinking rosé in the middle of summer, looking at the gymnasium, and I started to put together this idea of swings. There's a series of clevises had existed in the ceiling that were already there, that were used for the classic climbing ropes, where the enlisted men would climb up the rope, ring the bell, slide back down, climb up the rope, slide back down. And so I kind of thought to myself, what could I do to get people to exercise in a gym without realizing it? And so I hooked up 10 swings to the ceiling, and I called the piece competitive swinging, with the joke that you would try to touch each other, but I made it so that you couldn't, even though a couple of my friends actually slid out of their swings and tried to touch each other. The photographer at the time climbed up into the ceiling and grabbed the shot for me, which I thought was pretty remarkable. The inspiration for 5 versus 5 was that even though the court isn't basketball regulation size, they had painted a basketball court onto it. And there are 5 people on each side of a basketball team. One of the people had swung for long enough to where he actually ended up giving himself a blister and sent me this photograph of his hand next to the statement for the piece. Let's see here. Switch. The next space that they asked me to do something in, oops, this is when it goes slideshow without you. The next place that they asked me to do an installation piece in was up the hill, which overlooks a Nike missile base. And one of the unique things about the studio that they had given me was that there were 2 windows that were very low to the floor. And of course, you can't have windows low to the floor normally these days because little kids fall out of them. So I started looking at this space again and thinking about how I could move people from the inside of the space to the outside in a way that would play with light and darkness, and kind of look at the military concerns of the building, the area around it, and I kind of conceived of this idea of a large steel I-beam that people would kind of slowly go out one window and back in the other, and constructed that. Here's the missile base, which is out one side of the window. Here's the beam going out of the window. Here's the chair with the seatbelt. You didn't really need the seatbelt, but I found that people were much more comfortable knowing that there was a seatbelt. What I found interesting is that the swing piece, when you think about how high people were off the floor swinging, especially with the people who tried to touch the ceiling, it was much more dangerous to swing that high than it would be to ride this chair out the window. I worked with a local friend to hook up a series of motors. We decided that it should take about 3 minutes to go all the way around, which is the length of a pop song. We figured that was kind of a metric that people would understand. And here's one of the first people out the window, an artist at the Headland Center for the Arts. And there she is, 2 stories up, taking her 3-minute turn around. And what I liked about the piece is that starting inside the dark room, with people watching you and people wanting to actually participate, you go from being, again, the audience to being kind of the participant. You go from observed, or from observing to observed. And you start your 3-minute tour out, and then people can't really see you because you're outside looking at the world around you and looking at the space in a kind of a slow, ponderous way, and make your way back into the building to tons of questions like, what did you see? What was it like? Next person lining up to go through it. There's someone taking, a lot of people took photographs, which I wanted to, at some point, outlaw. You should tell people to enjoy the moment as opposed to photographing the moment. Here's another photograph someone sent me. I think his other daughter was downstairs. Again, here's the space from the inside. The windows, an attic, in an old, I believe this was a munitions building. That's it. The next piece I did combined the audience and participant thing again, in the sense that I wanted to move people from just observing to actually participating at some level. I'd been doing some work with memory and how we use our memory and how we recall our memories. And one of the things that I noticed in myself was that there were often memories from my childhood that I could only recall with certain smells, a certain scents just instantly had brought me back to these moments in time. I started working with smell and trying to figure out a way of delivering different scents without having people put the scent on them, or scent strips tend to be kind of complicated, handing them, touching things, things like that. And I also didn't want the space to end up smelling like a potpourri or a big candle shop. And so I worked with a couple of glass blowers in the East Bay, and we kind of slowly came up with a way of delivering the scents, which are 3 vessels. And I've brought one of the compositions here tonight for all of you to smell. And what I'd done is I'd created a series of compositions that personally reminded me of something, and then asked people to smell them and maybe tell me a little bit about what they reminded them of. The pieces were named My Grandmother's Garden, My Grandfather's Cellar, and then kind of a literary pun, which was Portrait of Gertrude Stein, where I did a rose is a rose is a rose. It was 3 roses. One was synthetic, one was bois de rose, and the other one was a Turkish rose. Marcel Proust, I did Madeleines and bergamot tea, or Earl Grey, which is bergamot. And then Old World, which is a series of scents that had been around since biblical times. And then one called Childhood Memories, which is actually in a group show in the city right now, which for me was popcorn, cotton candy, cinnamon Red Hots, and juicy fruit gum. Each one of those was literally, I could remember an era from each one of those, like going to movies or going to the state fair, or the really painful cinnamon kind of sticks and flavors that you would just kind of burn your mouth with. And then juicy fruit gum, I actually wanted to mix with a little bit of tobacco, but I couldn't. It's interesting, I could find tobacco, which was the leaf itself, but I couldn't find tobacco as you would find it in the ashtray. Because when I went to high school, all the girls who smoked also chewed juicy fruit gum as kind of a mask. And so you had to have the combination of the two to actually get to that in that particular place. And so this is the Old World, which myrrh, frankincense, clove, and pepper. And here are people doing what you're going to do in a little bit, smelling the artwork. The best email from this was someone said, "Your art stinks." Here's some of the drawings that were part of the process. The glass blowing shop. Here's the glass blowing lathe, something I'd never seen before. Really fascinating set of tools that are unique to doing laboratory glass. Here's the funnel being put on. There's that piece. So those are the 3 pieces, or the 3 kind of collection of works that I wanted to show in the past. I wanted to show a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 images of how I get there. This was, I use CAD software to kind of realize most of these projects. I do a lot of the structural analysis in that software. And here's an early, or actually the final version of the orbit piece, modeling it before I had it, before I fabricated it and installed it, all the way down to the control electronics. This next piece is one that I'm working on right now. It's called zenith. And the definition of a zenith is the point directly overhead. And this particular piece, I've been kind of slowly working on getting enough lead, but it takes about a ton, maybe a little over a ton of lead to take a person and very slowly lift them up off the ground in that chair, rotate them slowly 300 or 180 degrees and set them down on the other side. And so here is the contraption as it is in the CAD space. And then I wanted to show, I think I can get a video of it. Of course, there'll be a seatbelt again. I think I've got a museum ready to go for this one. We'll see what happens. A little bit slower than that. I couldn't slow it down enough. It's like, it shouldn't be moving that fast. I had to tell them that in the letter. And then the last piece is something that I'm working on as well. Again, this idea of moving people from audience to participant. This piece is called Human Kaleidoscope. Again, same chairs, arranged on motor controllers on discs. And the pattern that they're doing is one that I kind of stumbled on synchronized swimmers. I have a kind of an odd childhood memory of watching way too many synchronized swimming things. And pardon me? Synchronized swimmers is kind of what this is. And so 6 people get together, sit down on this piece. Again, it's 3 minutes, and the piece runs, stops, and they get to face each other, other people, etc. And so here's where I'm probably going to need someone to hold a microphone, because I brought 2 pieces to show, which means heads are going to have to swivel that way. One of them is something that I just finished at the San Francisco Center for the Book, and I was going to kind of run you through that piece. So this last year I was asked to be the artist in residence at the San Francisco Center for the Book, which was interesting to me because I'm not really a book person, but one of the reasons they started the program is they wanted to get artists that weren't necessarily book-based to come in and do work, both with the apprentices that they have, as well as they have 2 other programs with Bay Area artists. And so I got to work with a series of wonderful volunteers. I got to learn a lot about bookmaking, and I got to present something that had always been kind of a collection of really curious objects that I've kind of enjoyed. I call it a cabinet of curiosities, and I have 1 drawer for each one of the 5 senses. And I brought some of this stuff to show you guys. The first one is a series of optical illusions called phantograms. Polish engineer designed it kind of used it in the 70s. There you go. Used it in the 70s to do mechanical illustrations for repair manuals, and I kind of came up with a couple ways of playing around with it. The second piece, it kind of references the scent-based work. I don't have the stands here, but I've brought the piece that I call my grandmother's garden, which is 3 scents that remind me of my grandmother's garden. Let's see here. And so that was this piece here. Taste was interesting because I didn't think they would let me do it, but it turns out they would. There's a fruit that grows in South America that has a protein that bonds with the sour receptor on your tongue, and it makes everything sour taste sweet. And so you kind of suck on it for a little while, and your Guinness goes from a bitter drink to a milkshake, and your key lime pie all of a sudden tastes incredibly sweet. So that was that piece. The touch piece was around this idea of becoming familiar with the shapes of a number of the trees that we have in the Bay Area. Not necessarily the color of the leaves or the intonation, but the actual shape of the ginkgo. Yes, exactly. The last piece was a challenge, which was sound, because I didn't want to have to put an MP3 player in the box. Yeah, you're probably gonna have to hold the mic while I do this. Or actually, we'll see. You'll hold it in a second. So Thomas Edison, along the way to inventing the record player, had a number of different false starts, or maybe successes, depending on how you want to look at it. And in my research, I discovered one of them that I was quite fascinated by, but I couldn't quite figure out how I would remake it in the kind of today. And I stumbled on a company, a novelty company that had been around since the 1900s in the Midwest, and they were still making, well, they're still making them today, but they weren't making them in the time of Edison. And I had them send me all the different expressions that had been put on these tapes. And I had them run 4 of them for this project. And this one, if I do it right, is going to say, "How are you?"
Yeah, I'll catch that.
So it's up to 9 syllables, and they're, yeah. I think if you hold the mic underneath.
Okay.
Written and collaborate. I invite you to look through these pieces. The essays were written by a friend of mine in conversations over lunch about the project. Sound, sight. Here's some essays about the scent work, which I guess is already going around, if anyone wants to read that. I've also brought a couple of publications for you to look at.
Actually, Paolo, if I might ask the first question.
Please.
Tell us a little bit about the 10,000-year clock.
Oh, okay. All right. Stuart Brand, who I'm sure most of you have heard about, Brian Eno, Danny Hillis, in the mid-90s put together a project to foster long-term thinking. And one of the ideas they had was to create an object that they would build and put into the future, at least in our imaginations, put it into the future. And the idea came up to do a clock, a monumental scale clock, because they felt that that was kind of a benign object. It wasn't a temple or a church or anything like that. They started working on the first prototype in the late 90s, and it rang for the first time in the year 2000. And then they started working on a series of prototypes, each time scaling it up and dealing with the challenges of scaling. And then about a year and a half ago, Jeff Bezos gave the foundation about $42 million to build the full-size prototype, or the full-size, not even prototype, the full-size object itself. And so for about 12 years, I was the principal engineer on most of the prototypes for the clock itself. And I have a couple of videos which are kind of fanciful, which might give you a sense of scale. And so these are all to fit in a 12-foot diameter shaft that'll be 400 feet tall, about 70 miles west of Marfa, Texas. And this gives you an idea of the size of the clock. So it'll take about a half a day to walk through the clock. And you'll come out, you'll go in the base of the mountain and walk up through the works and exit at the top. There'll be a winding platform for each visitor to put a little bit of their own energy into the clock itself. This energy will be stored in a weight system. About 10,000 pounds of weight will drive the clock. Here we're doing some initial tests of the different mechanisms up in San Rafael. And the foundation office is in San Francisco, 11,000 pound test weight. There's Jake. Differential clutches, kind of a very large grandfather clock. And the idea behind creating an object and making it last that long was that when we go back in time, we have objects that are 10,000 years old that have markings or writing on them that we can build a narrative from that time to this moment. These people lived at this time, they did these things up to this moment. And so we figured if we created an object and we put it out 10,000 years in the future, we would go ahead and in our minds construct a narrative going forward to that point and start having a conversation. How do we get there? How do we make this present moment get to a place where this clock will still be functioning and working in 10,000 years? So there's two ways that we're going to power it. The clock itself, which keeps time, is going to be the mechanism we're going to use is the temperature difference between day and night. So there's a differential device that winds it up. And then the chimes, which will ring once a day for 10,000 years, will be powered by individuals coming and winding it up. So we figure if there's no one there to wind it up, then there's no reason to ring the chimes themselves. And so, whereas there is a reason to keep time, so we know what day it is what we did. You want to have... Right now we're we're 2 years into a 7-year schedule. So if you go to the website, you can log on and put your name in to get in line to go and visit. I want to show one other thing. So there's a lot of really interesting mechanisms that go into designing this that people will never really see because they're creating the space itself. And one of them was a saw. One of the ideas is that many of us had traveled to places where there were these amazing spiral stairwells that were cut into solid stone going down into wells or in other locations. And so when we imagined this project, we imagined that there would be one of these spiral, or actually they're helical stairwells, but we call them spiral stairwells. And so when we pulled the bore itself, we wanted to create a saw that literally cut all the steps out of solid stone. And I have one of the test videos from the group up in Seattle that designed this saw. It's time lapse, so it's moving quicker than it really does. Or that guy's a tweaker. So there's the saw itself. The saw blade is used in the Carrara mines to cut marble slabs, and then the robotics give a very specific shape. And this will allow us to kind of reach out from the 12-foot bore about 3.5 feet to cut a series of stairs, as well as the landings themselves into the limestone. And the process, we cut like every 2 inches, and then we break out the inches space in between so that we're not cutting the whole time. That would be one of the cuts, and it's going to take 1.5 years to cut the stairs, basically. Here's a computer simulation of the cuts. And that's what the stairwell will look like.
Year clock being put in such a remote location where you build trams to get the equipment in and be just away from where people can easily observe it.
So one of the things we noted about the objects that we have that are that old is one of two things. Either they're very far away from where people currently are, or they were lost. And so one of the observations that was made early on is that if we want something to last for a long time, it's best if we don't put it near civilization. And so we looked at a map of the United States at night, and we looked at the light, and where was it darkest? And so the objective was we want it to be a fairly dark place. We want it to be high in elevation, which means that we don't have to worry about a lot of moisture. And we don't want a lot of geological movement because we don't want an earthquake to take it out. And so that gave us 6 sites in America. And we kept it to America just because of cost. We didn't, there are obviously other places that are much farther away from civilization that it could be built in, but we just didn't have the resources to build it in the middle of Siberia or something like that. So hence the site that we currently chose.
It seems that you do, you work from memory and problem solving.
I do, yeah.
And what about just plain inspiration?
I mean, there's a whole lot of inspiration in problem solving.
Around that.
Oh,
Just
around that,
that
yeah.
Just comes from.
Currently, my practice is mostly responding to spaces, and so it's all, I might have some preconceived notions that I try to hold back before I go and see a space, but often that being in that space and listening to the environment around me kind of presents not so much options, but constraints. I feel like I work better under constraints. And so it's not that it increases the number of things that I do that I can do, it's that it limits them. And as those limits start to become very real, the work starts to really manifest itself in a beautiful way. And so that's the constraints, I think, deliver a better piece of work than not to have the constraints. And that's what the site normally does. Any other questions?
There were two things mentioned in the introduction that were interesting to me. I was wondering if you could talk about. One was this notion of the autodidact. So if maybe there's some things you can say about that. Also, these bicycle factories around the world. Could you shed some light on what that was about?
So, I mean, okay, so the autodidact is that most of the things that I have done in my life that have been enjoyable and that I've made money at had nothing to do with my schooling. And so my engineering skills, my artistic skills, all of the things that I currently kind of consider the genetic makeup of what I do and who I am right now were all self-taught. I mean, granted, really good mentors, really good individuals, occasional classes at universities, a lot more online than there used to be when I was growing up, but I spent a lot of time in libraries when I was young, and so that kind of goes to the autodidact side. I find that most of the people that I know who are doing really interesting things have a rigorous understanding of one domain, and then they choose not to practice in that domain. And so when I think about the underpinnings that I have in philosophy and my knowledge of that world, and then taking that and moving it into a different space, I think that that creates a really unusual or to me, unusual and an interesting environment to work in. And so for me, that was kind of revelatory, is like, what can I do with what I know somewhere else, not here with the people who already know those things and already practice those things, because we've all read the same books, we've all gone to the same lectures, and it's more interesting to be in a room with people who haven't, I guess would be that answer. And then what was the other question? Oh, bicycle factories. A boyhood love of bicycles. When I started doing my artistic practice, one of the challenges that I had was that most of the skills that I needed to create the objects that I wanted to present to the world, I couldn't do myself, and I couldn't afford the people who could do those things. And so I quickly moved into welding and fabricating. I rode with a gentleman. I'd built bikes since I was a young kid. And so when I had lived in Colorado, I ended up riding bikes with a gentleman who worked at Martin Marietta, and he taught me how to weld titanium. And at that time, that was like the skill to have to go anywhere you wanted to go. And so I went to the aerospace industry. He, on the weekend, used a lot of the equipment they had there to teach me the skills to do that. And with that, I went around and I taught a number of different individuals. And in fact, that's what brought me to Marin, is Wilderness Trail Bikes had hired me 2 decades ago to come here and teach them how to fabricate bicycles out of titanium. And so that was kind of one of the things. And so along the way, I picked up machining, I picked up CAD designing, and real practical knowledge of how things work, how they go together, how to make things, how to make them light, how to install them. I did a lot of fixturing, tooling. I did them in first world conditions, second world, and third world conditions, which is really different. When you have more people than you have money, how do you make objects? Things like that. So that ended up being a really interesting kind of a decade of fun.
Thank you, Paolo. You seem like the ultimate maker, synthesizing all these things together. What's your take on this phenomena, this maker phenomena that's becoming very accessible to almost anyone? Where do you think that's going?
I feel like it's in the beginning of the talk, I mentioned, how do you move audience to participant? I mean, how do you move individual from a consumer to a maker? How do you get people who are used to purchasing objects, actively interested in making them themselves or improving them, etc.? I think only good can come of it. I mean, if anything, it gives people a better understanding of how the things that they have in their lives are made, and that everything that they touch, everything that we own, a designer, an engineer, or someone has had, or a group of people often have had a lot of input on how it's fabricated and delivered to you. So I think that it's going to be interesting. I'd like to see what happens when the generation of children who are her age, where they're not going from one state to the other, but they grew up in this state. That'll be the interesting generation to see. The ones that didn't know the world before there was cell phones, or before there was the ability to go down and get something cut on a CNC wood router. Like, really? You couldn't do that always? that'll be the interesting generation to see.
If I can follow up with you're leading to a memory question. We were talking about memories earlier, and you just that's a kind of a memory example you just gave, coming up, never having a separate frame of reference or the old one, but just coming up with a new one. What got you interested in memories? Did that come out of your philosophical studies, or do you remember?
I came to it from a couple different directions, and clearly there's some part in philosophy, but it tends to be more rigorous than what I like to talk about in the art practice, because it gets into some messy philosophical areas. But as far as just people, how people just kind of use their memories, do you use your memories to make you happy when you're sad? If you use a memory too many times, can you wear it out? I mean, there were a lot of questions about how you feel about the things that you have in your head, and how you dole them out when you need them, or how you tell stories to friends that you have. I think we were talking about one of the interesting areas that I kind of uncovered as I was asking questions at one of my residencies was that if you and a group of friends have a shared experience, and one of them is retelling this experience, and there's a detail that you don't remember but that sounds really plausible, do you add that to your version of the memory? Does it now become part of the memory that you hold in your mind? And so little things like that were kind of what I was trying to tease out of how we actually use our memories and how we convey them, because we string together our memories like a necklace. That is who we are, and that's who we present to the world around us. These are the stories that we tell when we meet people. And, anyone who's been married for 40 years knows, I know all those stories. I've heard you tell them before. But, those are the things that we craft ourselves with. And so those are really fascinating to me, is what is this collection of memories that we use, and how do we use them, and how do they change? And that's part of the scent piece, as well as some other things that I've worked with. There's a question here.
So it seems to me that you're a master of both form and function, given your engineering and your artistic proclivities. In my experience, those two things can oftentimes be polar opposites, or at least disconnected with a large space between them. I'm wondering, do you feel that way? And if so, do you ever feel like you have to compromise on one to serve the other? Or does one end up causing the other failure in the other?
I feel like compromises are made often in life in general, not just in the practice of making a work of art. I think a lot of what people might consider compromises I refer to as constraints. There's either only so much money, or only so much time, or the space or the environment only will allow for certain things to happen. So when I think about that dichotomy that you're talking about, and how I feel like I'm trying to think of any example where it really resonates. I think that my fallback response to that would be is that since I am not professionally trained in either profession, I don't have the dogmatic challenge between the two professions. Since I didn't go to art school and get my MFA and learn about the canon and how I need to either fit or not fit, or position myself, or learn all the that world, I'm not necessarily beholden to it. And then the same in the engineering world, because I didn't go and get my engineering degree and study deeply the world of engineering, I'm also not trapped by that. And so I have kind of this interesting perspective of both of those worlds. And because I crafted that set of skills myself, being the autodidact, they all seem to work pretty happily in my brain. That's how I would say that.
I have another question about the 10,000-year clock. So you tried to create it to keep going based on the day and night temperature.
Correct.
And but how did you take into account for climate change or whatever differences are going on over 10,000 years? How could you project into the future with all the changes that are going on so rapidly now?
Mm-hmm. This is a good question. I'm going to start with one of the more interesting things that happened in the 10 years that I worked on the project is that, and hopefully I can explain this well. My grandmother used to say, if you can't explain something, you don't really understand it. So the difference between when the sun is directly overhead and when it's noon on the clock is only the same moment twice a year, and that's at the equinoxes. The rest of the time, it can be up to 15 minutes off. And so if you're keeping time based on where the sun is in the sky, you need to be able to correct for the time of year. And that correction is called the equation of time. And in the clock, we have a cam that is shaped for that difference. And so that when the sun is shining on a particular part of the clock, we know that it is noon from the solar time, and we correct for what astronomers and clockmakers refer to as mundane time, which is what we all keep. And that way the face can show that time. And so the interesting thing about that particular cam is that in the 10-year scale that we're talking about, there's another thing called the precession of the equinoxes, and that's that the pole of our planet that our planet spins around is currently pointed at the North Star. But when the pyramids were built, it was not pointing at that star. And it takes about 27,000 years to come back to the same location in the sky. And so you can imagine that over 10,000 years, half of that, what they call a nutation, has happened. So here's the interesting thing. We built a cam to represent this particular challenge, which was simply representing the difference between solar noon and mundane noon over 10,000 years. Enough of the polar caps had melted to transfer water from the caps to the equator to cause the Earth to slow down, so the shape of that cam would no longer be valid in 10,000 years. And that was really interesting and observable. Would not. So we had to recompute. In fact, we ended up creating a mechanism instead of a cam so that we can actually take into account for things like that happening. But as you can imagine, the ice skater, as they bring their arms in tighter or let them out, they spin quicker or slower, and the same thing is happening to the planet as that water moves from the caps to the oceans and to the equator. And so that was one of the things that was observable just in the decade that working on the project. To answer the second part of your question, which is how do you use the temperature difference between day and night? If you don't have a temperature difference between day and night, this planet is going to be a very, very horrible place to be. I mean, there will always be that difference. There's always a delta. Now, mind you, those delta might be really extreme. It might move into an area if we don't have an atmosphere where it's like the moon, where it goes from, negative 40 to 180 in one cycle with the sun. And that would be a really big delta between those two temperatures. But we're imagining that as long as we have an atmosphere, even if we have volcanic eruptions and other kind of cataclysmic events, we'll still have some delta between the temperature between day and night. And or difference, sorry, not delta, the difference between day and night. Delta is a technical term. And that's what we'll use to basically lift the weight, which causes the clock to keep the time. Okay, so I answered two questions. The first one was what are some of the things that happens if climate changes, and the other one is how will the device work that causes the clock to be able to have enough energy to continue running. And so the cam that tells the difference between solar noon and mundane noon, we had to actually create a mechanism to deal with that, whereas the part of the clock that powers it, when no one's around to wind it up, we believe, given that we'll always have a temperature difference, even though we may not like that temperature difference, it will be able to keep time. I mean, because there's a temperature difference in a desert. It doesn't mean you want to live there, but it's still there. So by putting it in a mountain, we have a pretty even temperature difference. I mean, again, even if atmospheric temperature goes up and down, we get a mean in that, so we don't have to worry about the clock being thermally cycled and the fact that we've buried it. The big challenges, I think, are more mundane, like how do you keep rats and bats, and you know what I mean? It's like, there's like things like that, you know. What does all that look like? And because the entrance is going to be in the bottom of the hill and the exit's going to be at the top, there's a thermal difference, and so there's the other challenge of like, have we created this huge wind tunnel as well? And so all of these things are challenges that have to be addressed as we're going through them. We have special gates to keep animals out and things like that. So I mean, they're kind of all have been slowly, you know, kind of worked on in one way or another.
I'm going to continue on the clock. Besides the sort of the elegance of the mechanical design and the clock, is there anything embedded in it that would give some signals or messages to future generations, or is just the monument of the clock itself going to be what they'll have to decipher in terms of what we were as a civilization, provided this does last several thousand years? I'm inferring a discontinuity in civilization where there's a die-off and then trying to tease out the question there. That's a good, I hadn't thought about that.
Because
implicit assumption, but
is that?
Yeah, I think that there may be the knowledge of this sculpture, this object, will maybe have faded from the memory of I'm assuming that.
So
yeah.
the question
is
then we'll be generous and we'll say, okay, it has been forgotten and rediscovered. Is that as opposed to we've all kind of vanished and
yeah,
and creatures with extra eyeballs come down and try to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
So let me. It's a great question, and one of the things that we do, which is really interesting when we look at civilizations that are no longer with us, is we make inferences based on what's left over, what they knew. And often you'll hear, did they know about zero, you know? Or did they understand that the moon precessed? Or do they understand that the equinoxes precess? And so when we look at like a Mayan calendrical system, or we look at any one of the civilizations that we no longer have, along with trying to figure out what the writing actually says, we're also kind of sitting there trying to figure out how well they worked with math. And so in some sense, if we look at our checklist and we go, okay, how smart were they? Did they understand this? Did they understand, you know, and if we look at that checklist and say, okay, well, if people in the future do a similar thing and they're looking at this device and they're saying, okay, well, they've got that, okay, they understood this, we have the sense that they'll be able to kind of infer from the devices or the methods of constructions and the devices with which, as well as the precision with which this object keeps time, kind of the level of our understanding of the universe around us. It's kind of the short answer to that question. What's my favorite color? Periwinkle.
How big will...
So another really great question. You can't use any liquid lubricants on a device like this. And so all of the surfaces that touch each other, we're trying to either make sure they roll or they're made out of something that has an incredibly long lifetime. Industrial rubies can be grown for palette surfaces. There's a lot of really interesting stones, jadites. There's a lot of things that we have that can be used paired with other materials. The other thing that we've done, which is to solve the problem, is we're not trying to keep accuracy down to the second. And so it's not going to tick that often. It's not going to, a chronometer 14,000 times a minute is what a watch ticks. We're stretching that out over a period of 10,000 years. So if you think about the life of a really nice Swiss watch, and you look at it's running on rubies, pallets are made out of interesting materials, metals, things like that. We're trying to stretch that technology, scale it up so that it doesn't break easily, and then stretch it out for 10,000 years. All right, you're correct. Correct.
How big will the black parts be on the clock, like the numbers?
it's still a conversation about that, but I would say that most of the kind of markings on the face of the clock will be somewhere around 1.5 inches, 2 inches in height.
All right, I'll ask a last question, and then I'm sure Paolo will stay around and answer other questions, and we'll have his workout over on the tables there. But Paolo, as I was spending time going through your website and looking at some of the brochures and prints that you put together, I think the piece that, whenever I even think about it now, makes me smile, that I think the most, is the brush skates. And I just wondered if you could show a picture of the brush skates and maybe talk a little bit about what your thinking was there, and if you can actually skate on them.
I had the urge to, it was an enormous studio as well, and so I had the urge to get a pair of roller skates and a broom and go around and sweep the place. And oddly enough, that night I had a dream that you could actually skate on brushes. This piece took me no time at all to make. I ordered all the parts online. They arrived in a week. I machined them, put them together, and no, you can't actually skate on them. It's art. It's an idea. Tends to be a favorite. It tends to be a piece people really like. It's like, of course.
Well, Paolo, thank you very much for coming tonight, and
thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you very much for coming out.